Hi everyone, this is Lydia Bryseth, the manager of Colorin, Colorado, and I'm so happy to be here today with Cristina Sanchez-Lopez. Cristina, thank you for being here. We have wanted to interview Cristina for a long time for Colorin, Colorado, and we are finally making it happen. So thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Thank you, Lydia.
We're talking today about special education and ELLs, and I know you have a lot of questions and comments, so we look forward to hearing them. Feel free to post them in the comment section of this, as well as to like and share this post. This video will be available as an archive here on our Facebook page, as well as on Colorin, Colorado in the future. So for your friends who aren't on Facebook, they'll be able to see it easily in the future. We do want to take a moment to thank our partner, the National Education Association. They have made this series of Facebook Live events possible, so thank you to the NEA. And we always want to take every opportunity we can to thank the American Federation of Teachers as well for their longtime support of Colorin, Colorado. So thank you. And the NEA also helped us put together a new section on special education and ELLs on Colorin, Colorado. Cristina was a wonderful advisor through that process, and we got to know her a lot better, and so that was a great opportunity. So we will be linking to that from the archived page of this on Colorin, Colorado as well. So now we have all of the housekeeping out of the way. I want to start by talking about a book that you co-authored. This is called Special Education Considerations for English Language Learners. This is actually the second edition from Caslon Publishing, and I want to start with this, for one, because this is how we got to know your work, but also because it focuses so much on the collaborative model, which we know is important. So I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the book and how it came about.
Sure, thank you, Lydia, for having me during this time. And the book, actually, the work of this collaborative model of sort of solution-seeking, problem-solving came about really early on with Jack D'Amico and Elsie Hamayan, really working on that process of having us look more broadly at what might be causing English language learners to have challenges in school. And so that was, maybe 1992 in their early work. And then with the work I did with my colleague Barbara Marler at the Illinois Resource Center, we continued that process when we were working at schools and during professional development. And Rebecca Freeman Field from Kazan really approached us about putting that process into a book and into a place that can support schools, states, school districts in having that sort of collaborative problem solving to address the needs of English language learners, diverse learners. And subsequent to that, I began working with my colleague Teresa Young, who's a speech language pathologist. So it's been about 17 years she and I have been working. So you look at like chapters 2 through 4 are really that collaborative problem solving that she and I do. And then the rest of the book really looks at the social cultural context for the performance that English languages have, that influence the performance students have in school. But also for looking at the sources of what might be causing the challenges that they experience in school. So that's it's a process in a volume. So
that's great. And in terms of thinking about the questions that teachers have as you're out doing trainings, focusing on these issues, I would imagine that those are a lot of the kinds of questions that come up as you're hearing people talk about them. I wondered if we could just have take a 30,000-foot view for a minute in terms of both over and under identification of English language learners in special education, and why both of those things happen and why it's so hard.
Right. When you look broadly at it, really in places that have significant amount of ELL support, bilingual education, ESL support, really systems that are looking at culturally and linguistically appropriate practices, the percentages of ELL students who also have special education needs end up being really close to monolingual English children, so that the percentages are about the same. When you move away from those, and you are in systems that maybe either don't have the resources or are learning about serving English language learners, so there aren't enough services or supports to address their language learning needs, then often we want students to get help. So then often, because special education is there, that seems to be the first place that people go. But for English language learners who are really just in that process, who they may be having challenges, but they're really just English language learners having challenges and going through that developmental process, special education isn't where they need to be. We need to make our English language learning services and bilingual services and culturally responsive environments, broaden those programs to serve them. So that's where sometimes there's over-identification because we don't necessarily have the services that we need for English language learners. And under-identification, I think people are a little bit nervous because they're wondering, well, they're English language learners. Of course they're going, maybe they're having challenges because of that. And so people are a little bit nervous to go the route of special education. But what we know is that our English language learners who also have specific language impairment, learning disabilities, reading, difficulties, are really already in our schools. They're already there. So it's really about building systems that allow us to find those students in a timely manner so we can support them. So making our systems more culturally linguistically responsive and building ESL, bilingual programming, dual immersion programming allows us to really be able to see those students in multiple contexts that are appropriate for them, and we're able to find them. But I think that's, from the 30,000. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
We already have some questions, and they highlight this issue. So one of the first questions we got is from someone named Paula Stachow. How do we prove to a team of colleagues that a child is struggling due to issues beyond language proficiency? What evidence is helpful to differentiate between language issue or cognitive and intellectual issue?
That's the big question. Again, building trying to increase the amount of support we provide English language learners. So given that the students are receiving ESL, bilingual, good, pedagogy for them, and you look at their peers, like peers, right? So we're not comparing them to monolingual English children, but other English language learners who have very similar profile, and looking at their rate of progress and their performance in school. So when you compare like peers who are receiving rich, really robust ESL bilingual programming and culturally responsive practices, when those students don't make the progress that their like peers are making, then you do have to look at why that might be. Now, the reason might not always be a special education need. It may be environmental. There still may be something either in the personal experiences of the child. There might be some trauma that's happening. So we want to get in there early and support that child, because given a really rich learning environment, they're just not making the progress that their like peers, similar English languages are making. So we definitely want to support them as early as we can. We don't want children to fail, especially if we don't want to wait for them to struggle so much. We want to be proactive and go in and support them as early as possible. So, and the other piece is when I see systems that have really good bilingual programming, or multilingual programming. So even children who have multiple languages, we can still keep those languages going. And that's a really good, it's a great resource for students, obviously long-term in their development, but also it becomes a really good diagnostic piece, because if students are struggling and it's in the English environment, we can work to enhance that. But if students are also having similar difficulties with, say, memory or, word retrieval, I just had word retrieval, any of those kinds of things, and it also happens in the home environment and their home language. That's not to say that it's certain that it's a special education need, but it's a red flag that it's not just something that happens in the English academic setting, but it's something that's sort of pervasive throughout their experiences in multiple contexts. And then we do need to collaborate with our colleague and, what might be the cause of these difficulties. And there are students who are English language learners who also have special education needs. But I think we're going to talk a little bit about collaboration, but it's so important throughout the entire process that we talk with our colleagues across disciplines to get their insights into what might be happening with the students.
A lot of our questions have to do with what the ESOL specialist is seeing and feeling that the rest of the special education team, maybe the speech language pathologist, or maybe the administrators as a sort of a school policy, don't want to test a child. You know, how does that ESOL specialist in their own role, his or her own role, then begin to advocate?
It's very important. I go back to my colleague, Teresa Young, and she's a speech language pathologist. We've been collaborating for, like I said, about 17 years. But she talks about her practice when she was in the Toronto District School Board. And, sometimes she would practice exactly that collaboration. She would try to initiate the collaboration because she was very, very respectful and honoring of the fact that she has her expertise in her field, but she knew that these were complex issues and that we needed to have the point of view and the information and the expertise from ESOL teachers, from reading specialists, from general education teachers, from school psychologists. And so I really looked to that model because she really would say, oh, so what do the parents tell us? And you as the ESOL teacher, what are you seeing? And so that she would invite and honor those other perspectives. And she as a special educator I think that was a really great model. So that I'm speaking to our colleagues in special education to really partner with ESOL. And then as ESOL and bilingual educators, that we realize that we have a really important piece of the puzzle. So we are very familiar with the sort of typical trajectory, that's interesting, the developmental progression that English language learners take as they develop their social and their academic English. And we work with students from all different backgrounds, from children from refugee experiences, children who are born in the United States who are English language learners, children with interrupted schooling, from all different language backgrounds. So that is a very big part of the puzzle, and it's important that we find ways to share resources so I'm speaking right now, I'm thinking about the WIDA Consortium. It has really beautiful, the standards and their can-do descriptors that help our colleagues from other disciplines to see very descriptively what is typical or what is the process that children should go through. So when things are not quite working that way, not that we immediately go to special education, but that we say, from this experience and from what we know about what should be happening or the trajectory that the students should take, we do need to support this child because he's doing things quite differently than his peers who are, have had very similar backgrounds. So I think remembering that you have a big piece of the puzzle as an ESOL teacher, and sometimes it means partnering with one other person. So being able to sort of cross over the bridge, my colleague and I talk about that, from your discipline to another discipline and partner with one other person and say, well, this is what I do when the child has, difficulties. What do you do from your perspective? So it could be your colleague who's a speech language pathologist, it could be a reading specialist or a classroom teacher, a school psychologist, but really taking the initiative, even if it's just one other person, to begin that conversation. I think that would be really helpful in that process.
And I think starting small is key. You have an ally because they've
Right.
seen that there's some success, right, in sort of
Right.
building those relationships. We interviewed an itinerant teacher who starts every school year by sending a letter to his colleagues saying, this is who I am and this is what I do.
Oh,
And he does that because he's in a lot of schools and he knows he's not going to have time to develop
Right.
relationships. But I think it's a great idea for everybody to sort of start and say, this is what I know how to do. And one specific question that comes to mind is if you hear about a meeting, even maybe just hearsay, like you're not even
Right.
informed officially, you hear about a meeting about a child who's an English language learner, and there's going to be a discussion of whether this child should be recommended for some kind of referral or testing. And nobody has approached you. You're that child's ESL teacher. what would you say to that teacher in that moment? How do they kind of insert themselves, but not, not burn bridges, but start to build them a little bit?
So it's already going on. So it's never too late to support that child and provide the other perspective. But so even if the meeting is happening and you're teaching, but you do hear about it, again, try to find that ally or administrator. And again, maybe not in front of other people, but talk with the administrator and say, we're making really high stakes decisions about this child. And I don't think there was anybody on the team that had that ELL lens. So whatever is decided really is partial, because we didn't take the entire child into consideration. And so I don't know, the question sometimes comes up, is it, ELL or special education? But again, my colleague Teresa and I, we really have been trying to reframe that as they're English language learners. They're always English language learners. I mean, like, they're somewhere in that process of developing their second, third, or fourth language, and they are having challenges, and they might also have special education needs. So they don't stop being a bilingual learner just because they might have another need or challenge that they might be having. And so it's a great disservice to say, one is more important than the other. That child is living in that, all those worlds at the same time. So I think it really is important to talk with especially administrator, decision maker, or those who lead the teams, and say how important it is. There are obviously legal components to this. There are laws that protect the rights of English language learners who may or may not have special education needs, and on top of that, is really what are we doing that's best for that student. So we do have to inform, because again, you might not be able to be at every one of those meetings, but we need to build capacity across the district so that there always is someone who has that lens at the table.
And it's worth mentioning that ELLs with special needs have a legal right to both sets of services, right?
Both, right.
So sort of building on what you're saying, it's not a choice.
No.
It's not that one is more important than the other, and they should receive both kinds of services, and the school is legally obligated to figure out how to make that happen. Right? I think it's important always to stress that. You had mentioned the parents, and so would you talk about, and families, what are some ways to collect the kind of information and data from families that would be really helpful as you're reviewing a child's needs and what support the child might need?
Right, and for all our English language learners, even before their challenges, I really inspired by the Funds of Knowledge work that Louise Moll did and has been doing, and with all his graduate and doctoral students, and with teachers, this view of teacher, sort of anthropologist, researcher, and really, believing that how important it is to gather these resources and strengths and assets that the family has as early as possible. One, because then you can reflect them in the curriculum, but also then you build a relationship with the family, and you honor again the family. But then that moment when the child might be having, well, even before that. So if the parent can share with you in those moments challenges that they have experienced, that I'm really concerned about my son or my daughter because of this. It's so the alert comes up, and that you can be on the lookout and proactive about those challenges. But also, if once things get, maybe instruction becomes a little difficult, or there's some challenges at school, the teacher has already created, or the school has already created, a relationship with the community, with the parents and the entire family, really, so that when we can ask those questions, well, at school we're seeing this. Is there anything that you see as well? And having that having that other lens. But it's hard. Sometimes parents don't really see the school teams until like there's this big meeting and everybody's around the round table, and that's quite intimidating. But if we can think about it a little more proactively and build those relationships for all, with all of our students' families, that those moments when we have to have those kind of sensitive conversations, they would be more open, I think, to share.
That's a great point, that the relationship coming first is key, because once you get to that meeting, you've got terminology, perhaps in another language, you've got cultural factors, you may have some kind of, whether or not the families actually understand what the meeting is for, what the behaviors are, what the impact of the decisions being made. There's so much that's hard for English-speaking families in our system, and so when you add on language and culture, roles in the family, expectations, all these other things, having a relationship beforehand, I think, is so critical to allowing those conversations to be as productive as possible. And you're getting the data of, you know, what is that child doing in their home environment, hopefully the place they're very comfortable, where they are working in their home language. And so we had a very interesting experience at a school called Wolf Street Academy in Baltimore, where two different stories came up that had to do with special education. The first was that they saw a spike in the number of Spanish-speaking children who were being referred for assessment for special education. It was unusual. They looked into it. It turns out their first language was not Spanish, it was Mixtec. And so this language was a language that there was a stigma, and so the families hadn't told anybody they spoke it. And it turned out there was a whole community, and it had impacts on how the children spoke and wrote and learned and expressed themselves. And so the school really took that under their, kind of took the community under their wing and tried to work on some kind of cultural pride, as well as saying, okay, these are what the challenges are. On the other hand, we met a family where the mother thought that her daughter had attention issues. And it turned out when she got to kindergarten, the teacher noticed something was a little bit different than it should be, and she actually had a hearing issue. And so she hadn't been ignoring her mother, she wasn't hearing her. And the school worked to get a hearing aid and eventually a cochlear implant. I mean, it was a really impactful experience. So, you know, that was just one school, and I think it's a case of under-identification or over-identification, right? But in the end, the school was paying attention, and so when they dug into it, they realized that it wasn't what it looked like on the surface, and that was what was important, because something else was going on in both of those cases. So I think, you know, the families ended up being critical in both of those, but it would have been very easy to just stop and say, the families don't speak the language, maybe they're not coming to the school because of their working schedule, and so it's, I think, you know,
that's a great example of taking the broader sociocultural context for that phase where you're trying to explain why the children might be having challenges. It's not just so clear cut, you know, it's either this or this. No, there's a whole range of things. Our ELL population is so heterogeneous, and you've just illustrated that. And so why they might be having challenges is as diverse as what you've just, in one school, is what you've just described.
And I believe I think they came from different countries, but they were all from Central America, and so there were some regional similarities there. So I'm just going to take a moment to welcome everybody who's tuned in. This is Facebook Live Colorin, Colorado. We're here with Cristina Sanchez Lopez talking about special education for English language learners, which is a hot topic. Even though we sort of addressed this at the beginning, I think a lot of people still are coming up against policies that are created by maybe administrators or special education where they're not allowed to test children before a certain amount of time. So for example, someone named Beth says, we're still fighting the myth that students must be in the country 7 years before we can investigate whether they're special ed. And a slightly different approach, Jennifer says, our school psychologist insists that we can't determine if it's a language problem until the 3rd grade. So there are these very specific kind of arbitrary deadlines or timelines that are being put together. And so I would, I just wonder, how do you respond to those comments?
Yeah, so that is a myth, and it's, I think, comes about from what we know about how long it takes English language learners to develop academic English. And so while it's true that it takes students between 5 and 7, 8 years, we learned from the work of Jim Cummins early on and other colleagues. While it's true that it takes them that long to develop academic English, I think it's sort of that older model of waiting till they're proficient in English so we can test them in English, right? So then they're proficient in English, now we can test in English. But we really are moving away from that model, and we go back to this idea that the children who have challenges that may be due to some intrinsic, or neurological or special education need are really already in our population. They're already in our school, and so again, it's a great disservice to miss these opportunities to proactively support these children early on. And I think this notion of culturally and linguistically responsive RTI or MTSS gives us permission to not the idea of when do we test, but this notion of when do we support and how do we support and how do we assess early on. So this notion of really enriching what's called like tier 1, so the classroom environment. How do we enrich that environment, make it more culturally linguistically responsive, use ESL, bilingual pedagogy in the classroom, so that most of the needs of most English language learners' needs will be met there. But then there are a small percentage of children who will need other support. So then again, proactively you can have small group instruction that's ELL appropriate in the classroom, but targeting those students who are having a little bit more challenge than other students. You're still not in special education, but you're providing student support. And this process is really fluid because they may have what they need so that they don't even need the small group instruction anymore. They have the resources and the situation was resolved. But then there are other students, and there are a handful of students, maybe 3 to 5% of students, that even with a rich learning environment in their classroom, even with small group instruction, even with sort of one-on-one or very small group instruction and support, those students may still not make the progress that you would expect compared to their like peers. And so it's of those students that you then can go on to further assessment and explore if it is in fact maybe not just English language learning needs, where you want to continue to support them, but additionally they may also have special education needs. But what this allows us to do is we don't, again, wait for them to have to fail or to have such difficulties that it's very difficult. The question is, when do we support? When do we intervene and support? Well, as soon as or before there are difficulties, right? So that's that notion. I'm describing 3 tiers of support, but there are systems in the United States where it's 7 tiers of support, right? And the process is, how to make the whole system more culturally linguistically responsive. And so I worry when it's this notion of waiting. While we don't want to over-identify students immediately that they're having challenges, we go to special education. But I worry about students who have challenges, who have anxiety, who have language expressive difficulties, who have reading difficulties, who have these intrinsic difficulties, and we need to support them early on and in a way that is culturally linguistically appropriate for them as early as possible. But I think if RTI and MTSS is done in a culturally linguistically responsive way, you can support those students early on, and then I think find the kids who are also have special education needs a lot sooner, I think.
Becky Bueno says, would like to learn more about linguistically responsive RTIs, so she is right on the same page. And Katie Myers says we use an RTI approach before developing an IEP. What strategies would you suggest? So I think both of those comments kind of highlight, this in the maybe in the ideal scenario, what does that look like, the culturally and linguistically responsive RTI?
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, that's sort of what we describe in the book, but my colleague Lori Donnell and I were able to do a guide, culturally and linguistically appropriate RTI squared. We did a project for the WIDA consortium, and you can just go on the WIDA.us website. It's a free downloadable kind of guide, and it has a place for information gathering. It also has questions to ask along different factors. So that's available free of charge. You can use that with your teams, and it's kind of a guide so that we have questions that we can ask during problem solving when we're having, the children are having challenges, but also a culturally linguistically responsive learning environment. It's huge. It's honoring students' languages in multi-languages. It's affirming their identity as bilingual, multilingual, multicultural beings. It's using pedagogy that makes content comprehensible and meaningful, while also teaching language, academic language, in a consistent, sort of articulated way throughout their schooling. It's bringing in their cultural and linguistic resources from home so that the students see themselves reflected in the curriculum, and they also learn about how other people live. It's building on their strengths. I think that's a really very big piece, and I really, my colleague Teresa and I are very inspired by the work that's being done at the University of Pennsylvania and other places on positive psychology and the focus on strengths and building students' strengths, all of our strengths, identifying them and using them. It's a really different approach because oftentimes we focus on student deficit, but really helping students find what their strengths are, as well as the family, and then when in instruction and intervention and assessment, and then when things are maybe becoming challenging, use those strengths to help them work on those things that are difficult for them. It's a culturally linguistically responsive learning environment has meaningful curriculum and instruction that's connected, and they don't learn things sort of in a reductionist way, but in a meaningful context. So all of these things that are really important and essential for English language learners, I think, make an entire system more culturally and linguistically responsive for all our students. Nancy Cummins from Colorado, University of Colorado in Boulder, I believe. Sorry, Nancy. So Nancy Cummins, her work with her colleagues on sort of designing schools with diversity in mind to begin with is just brilliant work. It really is. It's starting from the beginning to create these learning environments that are responsive to the diversity in the community that you serve, but it ends up being a rich environment for all the students. So Nancy may be in Finland right now, but because she does work there quite a bit, and but very inspiring her work with her colleagues on just that. So there are a few resources there that might help our participants today.
That's great, and when we go through our archive of this, we will make sure to put links to all of these different resources as well, and I think that's, again, another example of what's good for ELLs is good for everybody, even at a system-wide, school-wide level. So let's see, Rosa Maria says this is a very important topic, often confused as a second language barrier, and the LD is not identified on time. Let's see, Ashley is looking for practical strategies for monolingual special education teachers who are working with students in a bilingual setting.
Oh, so they're doing inclusion then, so I'm assuming the special education teacher is working in the bilingual classroom to support the students, is that?
Or if not in a bilingual classroom, at least in a bilingual school where maybe the teacher, I'm assuming, is an English speaker, but working within a bilingual program model.
Yeah, really, going back to that collaborative piece, this is very important. The work that's been done on there's research that my colleague and I have been looking at, and it's very interesting because this collaborative piece is so essential. It's not even just like a touchy-feely, feely good, to be working together. It's essential that we collaborate because, again, we have different expertise, and so we don't, but the student is sort of in the middle, right? So in that sort of interface, right? They are English language learners or bilingual learners with special education needs, and then we have two professionals who have different expertise. So what's very interesting is even if we're serving the student in these two different settings, or we're fulfilling our minutes and our obligation, unless these two professionals, or the bilingual educator and the special educator, unless they talk to coordinate and make that day cohesive to the student, the bilingual learner with special education needs, their needs will not be met. So we may, on paper, it looks like we're programming appropriately, but just having the conversation and like, what are you working on? What are you working on? Oh, so you have a unit on the solar system. Okay, I'm going to do the therapy or the work that I'm doing. I'm going to use the solar system, maybe it's vocabulary that they're working on or whatever. I'm going to make sure that it's tightly connected to what you're doing in the classroom. And so that becomes, even if it is in English, using ESL pedagogy, making sure they're visuals and all those things. But so then when the student is learning something in this setting, it directly connects when they're in the other setting. And we have made those connections for those children who are having challenges. And the other thing is, again, as a bilingual educator, our expertise is not in learning disabilities, right? We don't have the same experience and knowledge that our colleagues in special education have. They have vast, not just from their studies, vast knowledge and experience from their clinical experience, from their working with hundreds of children with special education needs. So what we need is to have a conversation so they can talk to us about how the sort of characteristics of a particular disability from their experience. And together we can talk about how the difficulty, the disability, the special education need is manifesting in the classroom. So I, as a classroom teacher, if you talk to me about this child is having maybe their difficulties is with auditory comprehension, so understanding the message, whether it's in English or Spanish or Russian, whatever their languages are, that and how that manifests and what it feels like to the student who has that difficulty. As a classroom teacher, I'm going to be able to put in place some strategies. For example, I'll know that when I pose a question, maybe everyone's doing think, pair, share, but I have to also realize that that child who has auditory comprehension difficulties, even if I'm teaching in their own language, they're going to need a little bit more time. They need time to understand the question that's been asked, to formulate the answer, to think about it, to comprehend, and then they can think about what their answer will be. So it's yes, a good practice to do, for example, think, pair, share, and to have students have that wait time, but understanding that this child has significant difficulties in that particular area is very important that you as the classroom teacher know. So that tightly really connected collaborative relationship is important because it goes two ways. We want to make sure that wherever the student is, both of their needs are being met, and that falls on the responsibility of the adults to, even if you're not co-teaching, but you're in like different situations, you may not be doing that. And even if you don't know the language, value the language and bring it in, have kids, preview things in their home language, with peers or from home, so that when you do your instruction in English, it's more comprehensible. You've given them time to think about what they might be, what they might, their answers are. But again, the collaboration benefits the student in every setting that they're in. So, yeah.
You had mentioned the student's schedule on paper, sort of looking, taking a comprehensive look at what is the student's day. Is it chopped up into lots of tiny pieces with different specialists and adults and services? When we interviewed Nathaniel Provencio a few months ago, he spoke about we asked him about the best professional development that he had done, and he said it was taking a stopwatch and following a child for a day and seeing how much meaningful instruction the child had. In this case, it was about 15 minutes in the whole day because the kid was moving from so many different places, and so I think that idea of saying, let's not just look at this little piece that I'm working on, but let's take a look at this child's schedule as a whole and figure out, are there some other ways that maybe we can strategically group. Also, we've worked at Mason Crest, which is a elementary school in Annandale, Virginia. They have been very creative about how they're a professional learning community, so collaboration is embedded in absolutely every element of the school. They actually use all of their adults to work with whatever children need the support. The special education teacher may actually have a reading group that includes some ELLs, some native English speakers, some struggling readers, and some special education students, or not. And it was very hard, as you can imagine, for the specialists who were used to sort of working with their kids, or maybe taking them out and sort of having this focus time to get used to this model. But once they did, it just gave them the flexibility that all the adults were available to help whatever children needed it. And so it's a constant process of reevaluating who's working with what group. Now, clearly that has to be something that comes from every level of, because you need the support, but being really creative about saying, how can we look at the schedules and look at the time and look at what students need and to intervene.
That's brilliant. That's because there's so much expertise in our schools, and if we remain kind of in these silos, we're not taking advantage of all the expertise in the school to be able to benefit the students. I think about that. We have social workers who have so much knowledge about social and emotional well-being and wellness, that we can, obviously that social worker can't be treating everyone, but if we can collaborate, we can learn from our colleagues and have that flexibility, then the entire school can be aware of those pieces. Or we have speech-language pathologists who know so much about language development and how to elicit language and generate language, reading specialists. We have all these colleagues in our buildings. I think that's brilliant to really leverage all those strengths to support the students in a more flexible way. That's wonderful.
Well, we were very intrigued by it as well when we were there. Let's see, we have a question. Would you recommend testing ELLs in their first language, since LD is a neurological disorder?
So, Lydia, you know what I feel about testing. Yeah, so this notion of standardized tests. I know many systems are obliged to use, a standardized test, maybe bilingually administered. But we have to remember that those tests are created with, well, one, it's a best sort of guess to predict the student's performance in class, and some are diagnostic and so forth. So it's one piece of the puzzle, like any standardized test. It's really one piece of the puzzle. So it's important that we gather instructional assessment, performance tasks, observation, oral language samples. I mean, it's important that we use more maybe dynamic assessment, more authentic assessment to sort of wrap around, as my colleague Teresa says, right? You wrap that around that standardized measure. And the other piece is that, testing in English and let's say in Spanish, because there are two tests, still doesn't represent that child, because that child is bilingual all the time. And so they know some things in one language, they know some things in the other because of their experience. They know some things in both languages. So any monolingual test of either language isn't going to capture all their linguistic resources or their knowledge or their functioning in terms of what they were saying about the challenges that they might be having. So there are no measures that really capture the bilingual experience that's going on inside of that child. So again, we can do some of these assessments, and of course, we use all of their linguistic resources. So whatever the process is, we can gather as much information in all of the children's languages. And even we've done, with very young children, bilingual retells, where the child uses translanguaging and uses all their languages to retell and explain an event or a story. So the language sample is in both languages and with creative use of both languages. That's actually a big piece that can tell you, in terms of comprehension, what might be happening. Now, that's not a standardized test. You can make, as I learned from my colleague, Margot Gottlieb has a really beautiful book out right now on building, performance and authentic assessment with students. It's a really beautiful book from, I think, Colorin. And so this notion of assessment of learning are those standardized tests, right? Assessment for learning, and as Margot talks about, introduces the idea of assessment as learning, where the student is really the focus of that performance, and they have a say in terms of how they show what they know. And so I think we really have to have a more comprehensive system of assessment that doesn't just rely on these standardized measures. And to answer the question about, yes, you use all their languages. And it's interesting because you mentioned first language. For some children who are sequential bilinguals, it's very clear that they had one language and then they added English on when they entered an English-speaking school. But for other students, a vast majority of our students, they are actually simultaneous bilingual children, so they have access to 2 or more languages very early on. And so again, these assessments don't necessarily capture that. They're not created for emerging bilingual children. So the answer is yes, you use all their linguistic resources to instruct, to assess, to intervene, and make it a much more comprehensive process, I think.
I know that sometimes there's reluctance for a child who maybe has special needs, or for maybe has a learning disability, particularly that's language-based, to either begin or continue in a bilingual setting because it's maybe thought to be too much or too complicated or too much of an overload. How do you respond to that?
Well, when we look at the evidence, really there's no evidence to show that children who have special education needs and who are bilingual have more difficulties than their monolingual peers of either language. So there's been a lot of work. Joanne Paradis from Canada does a great deal of work. Fred Genesee, all our colleagues, really what the work that they've done show that there's really they don't show more difficulties or different difficulties because they're bilingual. So there's no evidence to show that you need to choose a language. If they have 2 languages, 3 languages, then we continue to use those. Those are linguistic and cultural resources for them. So you wouldn't want to take any of that away from children. And it's so that to this moment, the sort of developing, accumulating research is that they're not disadvantaged by being bilingual. So we have to work with that evidence and thank our colleagues who do that research.
Well, I was cheating a little bit because Fred has actually written about that topic for us on the website, but I do think that we've been in bilingual settings where there's a lot of discussion about what is appropriate for a child, and so I think it's an important point to underscore that a bilingual setting potentially offers more access to all of the children's assets and resources, as you said.
And it's very interesting because sometimes people will say, well, when they're really significant needs, then it's going to be too hard for them. But actually, we think about that. The children who are bilingual, who have really significant, profound needs, we have to think well beyond the school day and the school experience, because often it's the parents and the community who are going to support that child. And so if we cut them off from that home language, we've just cut off an entire network of support that child's going to lead throughout their entire lives. So what we have to keep that in mind, to have the long view of that, not just the short view.
Very helpful. Thank you. Cheryl Moyer says, can you please address the challenges in parsing out cultural differences in terms of behavior social skill sets and the development of such versus a special education need?
Similar to sort of building capacity around learning the process of second language acquisition, I think similarly we have to look at that process of acculturation and how that manifests for different groups of students. But the other thing is becoming, and I credit a colleague, John Kibler, who really helped us to look at the fact that we're all cultural beings, and the fact that there are these invisible cultural norms that we walk around with in all different settings, regionally or in one country, in one family versus another. And I think first being aware that there's the educator, school staff, the school has a culture that's invisible to outsiders, but is well understood by everyone there. So I think the first piece is really just identifying what is the what are the cultural, unspoken, invisible norms within the school, and realize that just like that exists, for the school, that all the families, whether they're from other countries or other, ethnic backgrounds, all the families have have these invisible cultural norms that they're following and that their children are following. And so the idea is that really think about those until you come up against somebody who's doing things differently. So this notion of the eye contact. Well, if somebody is doing something different than what you're used to, being able to have a conversation instead of assuming that we all have the same cultural norms. And again, while we have cultural norms, like in the US, it's understood that time is money, we have to be on time, we have to be on early, all of that. And it's understood. Well, in other countries or other communities, other families, that isn't necessarily the case. Sometimes relationships or other things are prioritized over being prompt as far as the clock is concerned. And so there's not one that's better or worse, it's just different. And again, those two cultural norms would just remain invisible to us until we come across someone who's different. So I think having these conversations, just like you do about language, being able to, as a staff, talk and identify what are our cultural norms within the school, and asking the question, here, when we're in the US or in our school, when people look at you, it's in the eye, we believe that means you're paying attention, or that, you're being honest, you're attentive. Is that true in your family? And then it gives the child or the student opportunity to say, no, I'm not used to doing that. And every time, we have to look at people, it makes me feel maybe ashamed because I feel like I'm disrespecting the adult. Like opening it up to a conversation. And recently I was with teachers and they said that, make it natural to have these conversations about cultural norms and differences. There's not one that's better or worse, it's just different, and being able to have those conversations.
Right, and I think what you're trying to do is help students, give them the tools that they need to be successful in the setting that probably will represent their future in American schools, and not lose the norms that they have as well, and find a way. They're becoming sort of cultural code switchers,
right?
So that they kind of have that. I think Alba Ortiz, when we interviewed her, said that she grew up in a household where as you said, looking up at an adult was considered an act of defiance. And she was growing up in San Antonio, but she was, she had the cultural background of her family and her parents and her grandparents, and so that was, something where she wouldn't have looked an adult in the eye, and so that kind of is important there. I had one question I wanted to ask you about students with interrupted formal education. Krista says, one struggle we have is related to special education identification when working with SLIFEs, or student with limited or interrupted formal education. It can be tricky to advocate when you don't have the data referral teams require. So how would you respond to that?
So if we're talking about older students who come into our systems, who haven't had a lot of formal education. So when we're talking about the diversity of our ELL students, they are part of that diversity, to realize that their experience is much different than a student maybe who comes later to our school system, but who has had, all the formal education. And so what we do with these students, we do have to have sort of a systemic approach to what we're doing with students that come to us at a later grade who have not had formal education. It's not fair, really, to just, oh, you're the ESL teacher, here, go, right? Because this is a unique population. And so there are a lot of really beautiful programs that I know of here in the United States and in Canada that are newcomer programs or centers or reception centers that are both that are sort of that decompression time, that where you have you help children get through the cultural shock that is coming here, and then helping them become familiar with the school system, and they're older, right? So they're it's not appropriate to have like simplistic books and things like, but to find resources that are appropriate developmentally for them as young adults, but also meet their needs. But they do need something different, and some places it's sort of a 6-month piece. Sometimes it's maybe a little bit longer, and they get some of that initial language, English language, that helps them to get around and to I hate to say survival language, but to really help them with the linguistic piece, but also the acculturation. So within MTSS or RTI, that can be a sort of a systemic approach to children who have interrupted schooling, or actually that's different, a limited formal education from another country or another setting. And also in that time, it's important for maybe working with a social worker and others, because there could be trauma depending on what their experience has been prior to coming to the United States. So then there's that transition. Now then you may have sheltered classrooms, or if you have bilingual education in the middle school or high schools. So then you have a good articulation between the sort of newcomer program to their classroom base. But it's meant to be short-lived, but they do need something. They do need something that addresses their unique needs as they transition then into your ESL program, your bilingual program, the support, and the support needs to be there for the teachers as well, because these needs are unique. They may have they have life experience. They have a wonderful life, a lot of life experiences, but they just have missed certain academic pieces that have to be put into place. So we need to support the teachers who have those students as well.
And again, their families can be an important source of support as well, right? Information. In terms, you had mentioned programs in Canada. I know that you like some resources that you have found through some Canadian school systems for dealing with a lot of language diversity. Could you just talk briefly about that?
Yes. I'm so working in the U.S. We do have bilingual programs, and we have enough concentration of a certain language that we have bilingual programs, two-way immersion, bilingual, dual language programs. And then in working in Ontario and some other provinces, I found that the norm is to have multilingual settings, so 13, 15, 20 different languages, even in a classroom, and maybe 100 and something languages within a school district. And so I've learned so much from those educators who, when that's their norm, they of course pull in the resources, using the students' language as a resource to help them with their English, but to affirm their identities. And that's the other piece, the work with that Jim Cummins has done with Margaret Early on identity texts, and to how you use the children's, engage the students' language and cultural experiences to create these identity texts. So it can be using technology, using just their oral language in 2 languages, or in print, but that they use all of their linguistic resources for academic purposes, and also to sort of share who they are and their experience, and using that as a resource to help them understand the curriculum. And but yeah, I do have so I've accumulated some resources at different grade levels that are just links online, and also there's a wonderful conference if somebody would like to go to it, and in Toronto, usually in the spring, late spring. It's the Celebrating Linguistic Diversity Conference. Our colleague Paula Marcus and others, collaboration between the Toronto District School Board and OISE, the graduate school there at University of Toronto. Beautiful, wonderful conference, very multilingual, multicultural, and people come from all over it's a great place to learn resources. And then here in the U.S., finding school districts that do similar things. But I would love to share those resources if I can. And just
That's great. We will post those for sure. And we have a lot of friends and followers in Canada, and they have, as you said, some similarities, some differences. Some of their policies are very interesting in the way that they're different from our own. So one final question before we wrap up, which is that we started with the book you had written, and you've just finished another one. So I wondered if you would just briefly tell us about that before we sign off. Sure.
Thank you for asking about my colleague Teresa Young, and I. It's a labor of love for the last 2.5 years. We're working on a volume that is really a review. It's through Oxford University Press, and they have a really beautiful Focus on Language Learners series, and this is one of the books. It's focused on special education needs, and they've asked us to look across, again, all our colleagues in the field who are doing research, classroom-based research for language learners who also have special education needs. And so what are these instructional approaches that are most effective for our young multilingual learners who have special education needs, and as well as our adolescent students who have special education needs. And it's been an amazing trip, the amazing journey, I should say, to learn about these practices. And so, I mean, I can talk about some of the patterns we saw in these most effective strategies or approaches. Really focus on the student at the center, and really getting to know the student and their strengths, their linguistic and cultural strengths, their family resources, and also the conversation we're having about learning how that child's difficulty manifests in the classroom. So through instruction, like how is it manifested for them? They're in a very unique way. So that is sort of at the center. And then we found that the approaches that really worked also surround that child with instruction and approach and instruction and intervention that is meaningful, that is cohesive, connected, that is not reductionist. It's not about pulling them out to work on repetitive skill, but to work with those skills within a meaningful learning environment that is engaging, that really engages and focuses them within that zone. And then it's surrounded by a culturally and linguistically appropriate learning environment that looks upon the student and their family, honors their language and culture and their resources. And so that, we've sort of, when we pulled from all these studies, patterns that we saw, those are the kinds of things that we saw in the instructional approaches. So there's some really beautiful strategies that we found, approaches like collaborative strategic reading and structural conversations, and really bringing in their multilingual, multicultural I was going to say strengths and assets into the instruction. So so that's hopefully coming out next year, 2018, I think maybe this summer. But thank you for asking about it. It's been a labor of love for the last couple of years. Thank you.
I can't wait to see it.
Thank you.
We will certainly have it on Colorin, Colorado, no doubt about it, I'm sure, when it comes out. So that is going to wrap up for this afternoon. So thank you, Christina,
Thank
so
you, Lydia.
much wonderful information packed into this hour, and I know people are going to love to share this and get it on our Facebook page and then on our website and share it with colleagues. And we encourage you to use this in professional development and training. I think we maybe can even write some discussion questions and really use this as a tool because it's a lot of information packed into a short amount of time. So thank you, all of you who've been able to tune in, and all of you who are going to be watching the archive version of this. And thank you again to the National Education Association, our partner that's made this series possible. We have a few more events to go for the year, so we'll keep you posted on those. And also thank you to the American Federation of Teachers, AFT, for our longtime collaboration. So we will look forward to seeing you, and in fact I can tell you that our next event is going to be next Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern, with Sarah Moore, who's from the Center for Applied Linguistics, and we're going to be talking about strategies for mainstream teachers. So again, another great opportunity to talk about collaboration and all of the different ways people can be working together. So we will sign off for now, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Christina.